Today is June 5, 2018, and we are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the second month, studying the historicity of the Exodus in light of seeing how it reflects the character of our Heavenly Family. So let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to help us. Heavenly Family, we sincerely appreciate how much you have put into guiding us over these past several years. And thank you for all the messages that you've given across time. Please help us to understand what you are trying to communicate to us now, and help us to perceive your character rightly as it was represented in the past. And also help us to have our misconceptions cleared up regarding who you are and what you are like. And help us also to be able to go through this process in such a way that we're thinking clearly about it, and that we can enjoy the process of learning and unlearning. Thank you so very much for this. Guide us in tonight's study to see things as they really are, and to employ the right principles of investigation, and to be changed by it, to being the people who can change the world for the better. Thank you. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So by way of recap, we are looking at the historicity of the Exodus, as I mentioned, with the thought in mind of seeing how what we learn on this topic relates to the character of our Heavenly Family, and how we came to really see the need to study this is really, it was quite a long journey, and I'm just going to highlight some of the most important aspects. First, we came to realize that the idea of a scripture canon is not a true idea, and so we can no longer subscribe to it. That has many implications, one of which is the fact that we cannot simply accept as legitimate and as inspired and as historically accurate a writing that was included within a biblical canon for that reason. In other words, just because it is part of a biblical canon is not a good enough reason to accept its legitimacy. Thus, we have to actually test all writings, those outside of canons and those inside of canons. Not only should we test the writings themselves, but we need to test the assumptions that most people have when approaching those writings. Because if we do not question those assumptions, we have the potential of misrepresenting the writings and judging them not for what they say, but for what is perhaps incorrectly assumed about them. This we have found to be the case when it comes to the Pentateuch. Most people, including our past selves, have assumed that the writings in the Pentateuch were actually composed by Moses. Yet, when challenging that assumption, when not simply coming to the text, supposing that that is the case, but rather reading the writings themselves to see whether they even make that claim, we found that they do not. The writings in the Pentateuch do not claim to have been written by Moses. Further, they give every indication that they were not written by Moses, and as much as some people would like to portray these acknowledgments that we are making as being somehow against the Pentateuch or against Moses, they are not. For the simple fact that Moses and the Pentateuch do not make those claims. The Pentateuch does not claim to be written by Moses, thus acknowledging that isn't against the Pentateuch. We have no indication that Moses ever claimed to write the Pentateuch, and in fact, since the Pentateuch describes Moses' death, Moses probably never knew anything about the Pentateuch, so he couldn't have made a claim that he wrote it. So acknowledging that isn't against Moses. It's simply against the extra Pentateuchal claim regarding the Pentateuch. Now, since we have been able to determine that it wasn't written by Moses, that naturally raises the question of who did write the Pentateuch. And as we have found, there is strong indication that the Pentateuch is actually a mosaic of various texts that were originally separate from one another, but have been pieced together in a fashion somewhat similar to the creation of Mosaic art. Mosaic art is put together by taking tiles and breaking them into smaller pieces, and then piecing those pieces together with other broken pieces of other tiles. So the composition of the Pentateuch really came together in a fashion much like that. So while it is not Mosaic in the sense that it was written by Moses, it is Mosaic in the sense that it is a combination of several originally separate materials that have been broken into pieces and artistically arranged together. What are these independent writings, or these originally separate writings, and who wrote them? Well, as we have learned, scholarship over the past several hundred years has been seeking to answer that question. And really, there has been a consensus that has formed, and it is referred to as the documentary hypothesis, and it says that there were four primary documents that were woven together to produce the Pentateuch. They are designated by the letters J, E, P, and D, and in addition to them, there were several other fragments that constitute a much smaller portion of the Pentateuch as a whole, but were also included in the final product. And all of these things were stitched together by several stages of editorial process. We've seen that overall idea has a lot of weight to it. Like, there's a lot of weight to the evidence supporting that idea, to the point that we'd have to say that at least some form of that idea is correct. Now, when it comes to the historicity of the Exodus, understanding the documentary hypothesis is very important, because not only do we now have one source, which is the Pentateuch, which tells a single story of the Exodus, we now have multiple sources that tell different stories regarding the Exodus. This has advantages, and it also has what might be viewed as disadvantages. The disadvantages are namely that now you have multiple conflicting reports, which gives you more to sort out, and in a sense, it's more work. But the fact of having multiple sources is advantageous in that it allows you to compare them with one another and to triangulate backward to get at the potential historical facts behind the sources. So it enables you to conduct historical research in a way that historians want to. They want to be able to have multiple sources with which to work in order to access the historical realities which ultimately produced them. With this said, we have noticed that the stories in the Pentateuch regarding the Exodus have points of agreement and a disagreement, and we've been in the process of trying to discover what really happened. And our interest in this is not purely academic, nor is it primarily historical. We recognize that the implications of this investigation are broad and far-reaching. The Exodus is not a trivial event. It is an event in which it is claimed that Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, acted. And the actions attributed to Yahweh in the Exodus event and in the events connected to the Exodus are, at least in some instances, morally problematic, and that is an understatement. To be more specific and more straight to the point, some passages in relationship to the Exodus portray Yahweh in a way that is totally morally evil. Yahweh is presented as promoting slavery, as promoting genocide, as promoting the slaughtering of animals and children, and it's, a really awful portrayal. And if that portrayal was correct, then we certainly would have to object to this God. We would have to say that that God is, in fact, an evil God, not a good God. That said, we already know that some of the atrocities attributed to Yahweh in some of these passages, in fact, never happened. For example, there are many atrocities spoken of in the book of Joshua, which were supposedly instigated by the command of Yahweh, and yet many of the cities in which these atrocities are said to have happened have been excavated by archaeologists, and it has been determined that the mass destruction which Joshua claims, the book of Joshua claims to have happened in those cities, including burning them and slaughtering everyone and everything, it has been found that that simply didn't happen. There is no destruction there. There is no burn, remnants of fires in some of these cities. Some of them were ruins for 1,000 years prior to Israel being there. At least that's the case with Ai. So there's, basically the archaeological evidence in favor of the Joshua conquest is dramatically lacking, to the point where we could say with confidence that it simply didn't happen. So those actions attributed to Yahweh that are so atrocious couldn't even rightly, in reality, be attributed to anyone because they didn't happen. So we know that some of those portrayals are in fact misportrayals because it attributes to Yahweh evil deeds which never took place. So that at least causes us to question whether that's the case with other passages connected to the Exodus which attribute atrocity to Yahweh. And since Moses is understood to be Yahweh's spokesperson during the Exodus event, we want to get back to the historical Moses to see if any of these things that are claimed to originate with Moses really did, and if so, what is the character of Yahweh according to Moses, according to texts which could be reliably traced back to him. But we have to see if any of these texts can be reliably traced back to him. While the Pentateuch as a whole does not claim to have been written by Moses, and while J, E, P, and D all lack claims to Mosaic authorship and all evidence within themselves that they were not written by Moses. Some of them, and at least one of the editors of the Pentateuch, do indeed claim that Moses wrote at least some documents. And some of these documents are quoted within these sources that have been compiled together to make the Pentateuch. And this enables us to be able to read them and to examine the claims put forth by the Pentateuchal authors regarding Mosaic authorship. So there are 6 such claims in the Pentateuch regarding documents supposedly written by Moses, and in at least 5 of those 6 instances, the words which Moses is said to have written are contained within the passage itself. We have looked at the first 4 of these 6 instances. To briefly recap them, the first is found in Exodus 17:14. It is an passage which refers to Moses writing something regarding the Amalekites. Depending on how one interprets that passage, particularly regarding what that something is, the passage may or may not quote the words which Moses is said to have written. The next is found in Exodus 24, verses 4 and 7, also an passage. It refers to Moses writing something which it refers to as the scroll of the covenant, and the words which it seems to claim that Moses wrote are found either in Exodus 21, verse 2 to Exodus 23, verse 19, or within a broader range, including the aforementioned range, which is Exodus chapter 20, verse 22 through chapter 23, verse 33. So we took some time investigating that passage, and since this is a passage which clearly is claimed to have been written by Moses by the author of the document, we were able to ask questions like, does this document, which claims to have been written by Moses, itself make the claim to have been written by Moses? And we were not able to find any claim within it that it was written by Moses, and we were able to ask questions concerning the morality of the ideas set forth in this document, and found that some of the commands are moral, and some of the commands are certainly not moral. Furthermore, we found that this text, the scroll of the covenant, contained in this passage in as a whole, could not have Mosaic origins. The reason why we know that is because many of the commands have pre-Mosaic origins. So that which originated prior to Moses did not ultimately originate with Moses. Next, we looked at a passage in Exodus 34. In verse 27 and 28, the author claims Moses to have written the 10 Commandments. And in the surrounding context, it actually gives those 10 Commandments which claims Moses to have written. Those 10 Commandments are found in Exodus 34, verses 14 to 26. And since it actually gives us the words which it, being claims Moses to have written, we were able to ask questions such as, does this text itself claim Moses to have written it? And no, it does not. And we also discussed a little bit of the morality of the text. And we found that, again, some of the passages, some of the statements seem to be moral, and it's certainly a moral improvement on the text. However, it does contain some things that seem to be immoral, such as commanding the slaughtering of animals, commanding the breaking of the neck of a donkey if one does not kill a lamb instead of the donkey, things like that that are certainly immoral. But again, it itself does not claim Mosaic authorship, even though J does claim that for it. Next, and the last text which we have already considered, is found in Numbers 33, and it is something which is not actually part of J, E, P, or D, but was included by an editor known as the redactor, thought to be the final editor of the Torah. And the redactor in verse 2 of Numbers 33 claims this list of the travels of the children of Israel in their 40 years of wilderness wanderings. It claims that this list was written by Moses. And this list is found in Numbers 33, verses 1 and verse 3 to 49. In last night's study, we read through that list, and we found that it actually does not make a claim to having been written by Moses, and it gives every indication that it wasn't written by Moses, nor by anyone who took part in the Exodus experience, since it consistently and on many occasions refers to those who went through the Exodus experience in third person and in past tense. So with that said, those are all the documents that we have considered so far, and we only have two more to look at, and both of them are found in Deuteronomy. Before we look at the next passages, though, I just want to ask if anyone has any comments or questions regarding what we have already looked at, and if not, feel free to mention that you are ready to go to the next one.
I'm ready for the next one. Ready to go on.
All right, go on.
Okay, excellent. So the next passage is found in Deuteronomy chapter 31, and in verses 9 and 24, it mentions Moses writing something. I will also mention that this passage is attributed to D1, or the Deuteronomist's first edition of what we can refer to as the D source. The D source takes up most of Deuteronomy, but it is thought that there was actually two editions of this text produced very shortly, one after another. And so there's the first edition, second edition. Both are thought to have been composed by the same individuals, potentially. And it's really described more fully in the book Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. He goes into exactly why he and others think that Deuteronomy actually had two editions to it, or I should say the D source. Deuteronomy is a bit broader than the D source. There are some parts that are inclusions by a redactor, and also parts from E, from J, and from P. So, in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9, we read, "And Moses wrote this instruction and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who were carrying the ark of Yahweh's covenant, and to all of Israel's elders." Okay, so it says, and Moses wrote this instruction. What instruction is that exactly? Before answering that question, I'll also read from verse 24 of the same chapter. It says, "And it was when Moses finished writing the words of this instruction on a scroll to their end," and that's the end of verse 24, but I'll read on. "And Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, saying, Take this scroll of instruction and set it at the side of the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, your God, and it will be there for you as a witness. Okay, so these two texts refer to Moses having written something in a scroll, and that something was put at the side of the Ark of the Covenant, and we are left with the question of what exactly was it? So this is something that needs to be investigated more and tested more, but I'll just tell you what most scholars think. Most scholars think that what Moses wrote, or what D is claiming Moses to have written, is a collection of laws found in Deuteronomy chapter 12 to Deuteronomy 26. More specifically, in Richard Elliott Friedman's book, he has it from Deuteronomy 12 verse 1 to Deuteronomy 26 verse 15. And it's an interesting set of laws, and I don't think we're going to have time to read them all together on these calls during this feast, since tomorrow night is our last meeting of the feast. So I'm not exactly sure how we're going to go about looking at this and considering what it has to say. Maybe we'll just start from the beginning and read however far we get. But basically, that is the section that most scholars think is being referred to. And maybe that's the case. But I would say that it would be good for us to really assess that. Someone should really read the entirety of Deuteronomy to see exactly what it claims. I will say that the first part of Deuteronomy certainly does not claim to be written by Moses, and Deuteronomy as a whole does not claim to be written by Moses. But it does contain words which it claims Moses to have spoken, for sure. So let me ask, are there any questions or comments or suggestions as to how we should go about taking a look at this portion? And if it's simply that you think we should just start reading from chapter 12, then we can do that.
I guess we might as well start, because what else are we going to do?
Okay, great suggestion. Yeah, let's go back to Deuteronomy 12. I want to start by reading a footnote for Deuteronomy 12 in Richard Elliott Friedman's book, The Bible with Sources Revealed. Deuteronomy 12 verse 1, he has a footnote which says, Deuteronomy 12 to 26 is a corpus of law known as the Deuteronomic Law Code. It is identified by the symbol DTN. It is an old, independent document that was used by the Deuteronomistic historian in the Deuter 1 edition of the work. There are passages in which the Deuteronomistic historian may have expanded on the text, but it is now difficult to separate such expansions from the core text of laws. I will also mention that elsewhere in this list of laws, let's see, there's at least one other footnote, maybe more, that indicate that some of these laws may be older. Maybe I'll read a couple of these footnotes first, and then we'll get into it. Let's see, at the end of Deuteronomy 17, there's another footnote in which Richard Elliott Friedman simply references a book by Baruch Halpern called The Constitution of Monarchy in Israel, that talks about the origin of the Deuteronomic law of the king as derived from the time of the inauguration of the first king of Israel. So that's suggesting that this law came into being at the time of Saul. So that would be after the time of Moses. So that's something to consider. And then also in Deuteronomy 20, verse 1, Richard Elliott Friedman puts another footnote which says, the laws of war in Deuteronomy 20 and 21 appear to be directed to the entire people who have been mustered for military service, not to a professional army. Professional armies are claimed for biblical Israel only in the era of the monarchy. These laws, therefore, 1, do not appear to derive from the court, and 2, appear to derive from the period before the monarchy. Thus, even if we trace the Deuteronomistic history to the period of Josiah and a second edition in the Babylonian exile, portions of these laws in DTN may come from much earlier sources. So that's another important footnote. I knew I wanted to read at least that one in case we don't get there. And those are actually all the footnotes that are contained in the translation of Deuteronomy 12 to 26. So would anyone like to volunteer to read, let's say, the entirety of Deuteronomy chapter 12? And then maybe we can see if there are any comments or questions regarding it.
I'm happy to read it. Deuteronomy 12, and I'm reading from the NET. These are the statutes and ordinances you must be careful to obey as long as you live in the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess. You must by all means destroy all the places where the nations you are about to dispossess worship their gods, on the high mountains and hills and under every leafy tree. You must tear down their altars, shatter their sacred pillars, burn up their sacred Asherah poles, and cut down the images of their gods. You must eliminate their very memory from that place. You must not worship the Lord your God the way they worship, but you must seek only the place he chooses from all your tribes to establish his name as his place of residence, and you must go there. And there you must take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the personal offerings you have prepared, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. Both you and your families must feast there before the Lord your God and rejoice in all the output of your labor with which he has blessed you. You must not do like we are doing here today, with everyone doing what seems best to him, for you have not yet come to the final stop and inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. When you do go across the Jordan River and settle in the land he is granting you as an inheritance, and you find relief from all the enemies who surround you, you will live in safety. Then you must come to the place the Lord your God chooses for his name to reside, bringing everything I am commanding you, your burnt offerings, sacrifices, tithes, the personal offerings you have prepared, and all your choice votive offerings which you devote to him. You shall rejoice in the presence of the Lord your God, along with your sons, daughters, male and female servants, and the Levites in your villages, since they have no allotment or inheritance with you. Make sure you do not offer burnt offerings in any place you wish, for you may do so only in the place the Lord chooses in one of your tribal areas. There you may do everything I am commanding you. On the other hand, you may slaughter and eat meat as you please when the Lord your God blesses you in all your villages. Both the ritually pure and impure may eat it, whether it is a gazelle or an ibex. However, you must not eat blood, pour it out on the ground like water. You will not be allowed to eat in your villages your tithe of grain, new wine, olive oil, the firstborn of your herd and flock, any votive offerings you have vowed, or your free will and personal offerings. Only in the presence of the Lord your God may you eat these, in the place he chooses. This applies to you, your son, your daughter, your male and female servants, and the Levites in your villages. In that place you will rejoice before the Lord your God in all the output of your labor. Be careful not to overlook the Levites as long as you live in the land. When the Lord your God extends your borders as he said he would do, and you say, I want to eat meat just as I please, you may do so as you wish. If the place he chooses to locate his name is too far for you, you may slaughter any of your herd and flock he has given you just as I have stipulated. You may eat them in your villages just as you wish. Like you eat the gazelle or ibex, so you may eat these. The ritually impure and pure alike may eat them. However, by no means eat the blood, for the blood is life itself. You must not eat the life with the meat. You must not eat it. You must pour it out on the ground like water. You must not eat it so that it may go well with you and your children after you. You will be doing what is right in the Lord's sight. Only the holy things and votive offerings that belong to you, you must pick up and take to the place the Lord will choose. You must offer your burnt offerings, both meat and blood, on the altar of the Lord your God. The blood of your other sacrifices you must pour out on his altar while you eat the meat. Pay careful attention to all these things I am commanding you, so that it may always go well with you and your children after you, when you do what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. When the Lord your God eliminates the nations from the place where you are headed and you dispossess them, you will settle down in their land. After they have been destroyed from your presence, be careful not to be ensnared like they are. Do not pursue their gods and say, how do these nations serve their gods? I will do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God the way they do. For everything that is abhorrent to him, everything he hates, they have done when worshiping their gods. They even burn up their sons and daughters before their gods. You must be careful to do that's chapter 13, verse 1. No, this says verse 32.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I guess this is different in the Hebrew text versus the Greek text, I assume. So the Jewish numbering and the Christian numbering is different. You can go ahead and read it if you like.
Yeah, so it just says, you must be careful to do everything I am commanding you. Do not add to it or subtract from it.
Okay. All right, so are there any comments regarding this passage?
It's pretty funny that the life is in the blood, but if the blood's not in the ibex and the life's not in the ibex, like what? Like it's almost like it's painting it as noble not to eat the blood because the life is in the blood. But the animal's dead. It's like, what good is blood out of the animal?
Yeah, I hear you. It's like it seems to express more concern for the blood than the animal itself. Yeah, really interesting and odd.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask the footnote of Richard Elliott Friedman, when he says here at the end that there are passages in which the Deuteronomistic historian may have expanded on the text, but it is now difficult to separate such expansions from the core text of laws. And as we were reading that, I was kind of wondering, how was he able, does he say how he was able to decipher decipher what was an expansion on a text?
I think he's saying that they can't decipher what is an expansion on a text. Yeah, I think he's saying that he and other scholars can't really decipher that.
But they know there is an expansion somehow.
No, it doesn't seem like he's saying that they know. He says that there are passages in which the Deuteronomistic historian may have expanded on the text. And so he's putting it out there as a possibility, not as a certainty, because really you wouldn't be able to say for sure unless you could identify instances of it. But he's saying it's at least difficult to separate such expansions. So he doesn't give any examples or show any certainty as to being able to do that, nor does he seem to claim knowledge that that has in fact happened. But I think that the reason why that is put forward is because it seems to be overall an ancient collection of laws, more ancient than the time of the Deuteronomistic historian, but certain things may reflect different periods. Like, later in Deuteronomy 20 and 21, he gave the footnote saying that this collection of laws seems to derive from the period before the monarchy. But then there's laws regarding the king. And he cited another scholar who argues that those laws derived from the time of the first king of Israel. Well, that would indicate that some of the laws here originated in a period different from other of the laws. So if that's the case, then there's some sort of source criticism that hypothetically could be done even to this core. And then potentially the Deuteronomistic historian was stitching some of these things together, which may have included expansions like we find when other editors stitch things together. So it's kind of like a speculation that isn't without reason, but has not yet really been established in any sort of demonstrable way.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, I have some things that I want to mention. Okay, so first of all, does it claim to be written by Moses? The name Moses doesn't appear there, but it does speak in first person, where it starts to quote what, let me see here. Where does it begin? So it just says, these are the statutes and ordinances you must be careful to obey as long as you live in the land, et cetera, et cetera. I should have gone previous a little bit, but while in here you don't see, or I don't remember seeing or reading anything where it says, I, Moses, it does say I and me several times in the document. So it's written from a first-person perspective as if that person was present and speaking or writing to people that he, interacted with and was instructing what to do. So as far as I can remember, that's like one of the first times, if not the first time, that we've come across a first-person instructions in the documents that are claimed to have been written by Moses. So I just noted that I found it very interesting, even though it may not be, solid proof one way or the other, but it might be worthwhile delving into it more. A few other things about this text that I noticed, and I don't know if I'll remember everything. I wasn't really able to take down notes because I was reading, but it promotes corporeality of God, physicality of God, because it stresses that you can only, choose one place where God's actually going to choose, but that place, that's where you have to go to worship, because that's going to be God's residence. That's going to be where God dwells. In other words, he's not everywhere, permeating everything, and that sort of thing. No, there's physicality involved, and you have to go to a specific location. So that's notable in my mind. Some of the other things, now I'd have to look into this more, but in verse 12, it says, you shall rejoice in the presence of the Lord your God, along with your sons, daughters, male and female servants, and the Levites in your villages, since they have no allotment or inheritance with you. Now, it does say male and female servants, at least that's how it's translated in this version. I don't know if the word there really means something more akin to slave or not. A servant is different than a slave, depending on, I guess, the definition of the term in your language or your vernacular or whatever. But in my mind, a servant can be very different from a slave. A servant might be paid. They might just be someone who serves and gets compensation, but not necessarily enslaved, like they have no choice. So if it's not, more akin to a slave, well, then this passage doesn't seem to promote slavery as far as I recall. Go ahead.
I just want to say that so far as I understand the language, it's probably the same word for slave and servant.
Okay.
And but I will say, though, that giving a law that mentions slaves isn't the same as giving slavery laws.
Yes.
And so even mentioning slaves isn't the same as promoting slavery. The ancient world was a world of slavery, and you couldn't not mention slaves unless you were going to just ignore that part of reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of dovetails into the next thing I wanted to say, and that has to do with the issue of not eating the blood and the whole aspect of sacrifices, animal sacrifices. Okay, so this passage does mention animal sacrifices, and it gives instruction concerning those animal sacrifices. And I would have to look at it more, but one of the things that seems to come across to me is that it's really kind of downplayed. It's not, the focus isn't so much on, how to kill the animal and how, and that you should kill an animal necessarily, but it's kind of restricting a bit about it. You can't just do it anywhere at any time. And when you do, don't eat the blood, because that's what the heathen do, and the life is in the blood. Like, I'm open to the possibility, at least. Well, how do I want to go about this? Okay, I think first I'll say this. So, while killing animals is immoral, if our Heavenly Family was working on correcting that immorality in the people that they have called out, and they know that, okay, just like with us, right, we don't get corrected on every point all at once. Now, you may think, yeah, but we're not killing animals. But I don't know, like, where you would draw the line necessarily. So if our Heavenly Family knows, okay, this is how much they can handle right now, they're entrenched in animal sacrifices and even potentially human sacrifices. And I detest that. And, that's not moral, so we're going to try to change gears here. So if they start restricting certain things, like, look, the blood is off limits because that's the life. If they start training the people to be focusing on, oh, we're taking the life of something, and then, limiting the amount of sacrifices they can even do by restricting the locality where you can offer sacrifices in the first place, like that might be, like I can see God doing that.
So I have a comment on this. One of the things that I noticed here is that while it restricts ritual slaughter of animals that we'll call sacrifice to one place, it doesn't restrict killing animals.
Yeah, you're right. It just says you can eat meat whenever you please.
Exactly. It only says, so it doesn't at all, in fact, so far as I can tell, seem to be restricting the killing of animals. It just seems to be separating the killing of animals from ritual, other than in one place.
Yeah, I see that.
So it's like,
verse 20.
For most people in the ancient world, killing an animal was done as part of a ritual. Like, for most people, it was not the case that people would just kill animals and eat them in order, to just eat, without involving some sort of ritual in relation to a god as part of that. It was a very, very common thing to have the slaughter of animals being a ritual thing. So this seems to be separating those two things for most people most of the time. The only exception is the firstborn are to be brought, and when you want to actually do a ritual sacrifice, then you come to this one location. All the implications of that, I'm not entirely sure yet. Like one might suppose, oh, well, maybe they were permitted to eat because they just needed to eat for survival. In order to have all the nutrients that they need to be able to eat meat or whatever. I don't know if that's really the case, but here's the thing. It doesn't seem in this passage like it's allowing the eating of meat due to survival, because it also has the commands regarding burnt offerings, and the burnt offerings are not supposed to be eaten by any human. It's just offered up all on the altar, the whole animal with the blood and everything. No one's eating that. So that's the killing of an animal that clearly has nothing to do with the survival or sustenance of a human being. That is all ritual.
That's a good point.
So it's like...
That's verse 27.
Yeah. So, you do have the killing of animals entirely for the sake of ritual in this passage. And then, at the same time, you have the killing of animals totally separated from ritual for most people most of the time in most places. Because again, most people most of the time are not going to be in this one place where sacrifice is to be done. So I don't know exactly what that's about. Like, if it is having to do with minimizing at all, it might be saying, like, it could be that there's two concessions happening. If this is about concession, the other option is that this is just purely objectionable, right? And by explaining the possibility of concession, I'm not trying to advocate the possibility of concession or minimize the possibility of the entire thing just being totally objectionable. But I think we have to make sure to realistically consider both options, understanding that it is certainly the case. We see it with ourselves in our own experience that our Heavenly Family does have to progressively take people from one step to the next, and even allow people in that progression to do immoral things. That's the sad reality we live in. So whether this is concession or not, concession is a real thing. And yeah, it's sad, but it's simply not going to happen that people are going to reform all the way entirely and everyone doing it, you know.
Adventism didn't begin with vegetarianism. Didn't even begin with unclean meat abstination, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is something where we know our Heavenly Family is leading Adventism, but that isn't something that they corrected immediately because they understand that people aren't going to go for it. And Ellen White, she talks about this and how our Heavenly Family wanted to do it at the pace that would bring as many people along as possible, because otherwise, if you go with the whole immediate thing, yeah, you're saying it right away, but there's going to be less people overall who are going to listen, so you defeat your own purpose. If your purpose is to stop people from eating meat and killing animals, the most effective way is not to just say that up front immediately to everyone, because more people will reject it. You have to first guide people to seeing the reason to that, and you have to do that through step by step by step. Just like for us, we wouldn't even be talking about any of this if it wasn't for our Heavenly Family starting with, oh, by the way, you know, there's some apocryphal books out there that you should be willing to consider. Like, they had to go there. They couldn't. You know, for us right now to be sitting here and knowing that animal sacrifice is a bad thing, we wouldn't have even been open to that unless our Heavenly Family took us on this step-by-step journey, starting with things that have nothing to do with the subject. So we just have to keep that in mind, that as objectionable as it is, it cannot happen that you just jump right to the end result. That's not going to be an effective way of guiding a people away from an evil.
And since you mentioned it, I think it'll be good for people to be able to go and check out where she says this. It's in Volume 1 of Testimonies for the Church, in a testimony titled Errors in Diet. And I don't have a page number or anything. I just remember that.
Yeah, but it'll be easy to find just looking at the table of contents.
Oh, yeah.
With that information. Okay, so the concession idea, I just want to explain this as a possibility. So a possibility here in Deuteronomy, if this does originate from our Heavenly Family and all of that, which again, these are big ifs, we still have to verify this, but it could be that there are two concessions happening. One concession may be the idea of ritual slaughter at all. So killing animals in order to worship. And if that is a concession, then it is dramatically reduced. You know, ritual slaying of animals in this passage is dramatically reduced because it's not allowing people to do ritual slaughter anywhere but one place. And seriously, like, if you just take that into account, like, most people of most systems of worship to gods in the ancient world could slaughter animals in honor of that god or in service to that god anywhere, anytime. This greatly restricts the total amount of ritual slaughtering that would happen. So if there's a concession in regard to ritual slaughter, then this is greatly reducing the amount of it, which would at least be a huge step in the right direction. Now, it's possible that that isn't the only concession, and that actually killing animals at all is another concession. If that's the case, then it would be the case that basically our Heavenly Family would be saying, you can do it, but you can't do it in honor of me. You can't do it connected to me. If you're going to be doing all these slaughters, we will disconnect it from worship to any god or from worship even to us. And it would be a step in the direction of saying, we are not pleased with this, we don't want it. So it could be kind of a dual concession that's happening. Yes, allowing ritual slaughter, but greatly reduced. Yes, allowing killing animals, but reducing the instances in which it could be connected to being in homage to Yahweh. Again, I mention this only as a possibility, as a hypothesis that people have to test, not as an explanation that I'm giving of the passage.
I'm just wondering if maybe there might even be a need for closer examination of this, because as I'm listening to you, I'm skimming these passages more, and I know we won't be able to go into it all tonight because we've been on for over an hour already, but I'll just throw it out here, and hey, if you have a definitive answer or response to that, that's cool. And if not, then people can have it in mind to be looking at deeper. But, you know, basically starting around verse 15, it's a little confusing for me, to be honest, because it starts out by saying, on the other hand, you may slaughter and eat meat as you please when the Lord your God blesses you in all your villages. Both the ritually pure and impure may eat it, whether it is a gazelle or an ibex. Okay, well, I mean, just mentioning the ritually pure and impure connects it to ritual. I mean, because if it's just eating a meal any old time for any old reason, if there's no kind of offering involved there, seems like it wouldn't matter to mention whether you're ritually pure or impure. So I'm a little confused by that.
You want me to comment on that right now or not yet?
I'll finish for a second because there might be correlation or connection overlap. So, okay, so then he mentions, you know, hey, however, you must not eat the blood, etc. You will not be allowed to eat in your villages your tithe of grain, new wine, olive oil, which, by the way, a tithe of olive oil, that makes me think of the piece of new oil, you know, potentially. But anyway, you wouldn't mention the Feast of Wood because you don't eat wood. But anyway, and then, you know, it goes on to say, only in the presence of the Lord your God may you eat these in the place he chooses. And then in verse 20, it says, when the Lord your God extends your borders, as he said he would do, and you say, I want to eat meat just as I please, you know, it goes on to say, you may do so as you wish, if the place he chooses to locate his name is too far for you. So again, connecting those things, I read that with a slightly wrong emphasis. It's a new sentence starting. If the place he chooses to locate his name is too far for you, you may slaughter any of your herd and flock he has given you, just as I have stipulated, right? So you may eat them in your villages just as you wish. Now, again, connecting this to the other thing, it's a little confusing because in one aspect, I could see it being just as I've stipulated. In other words, eat meat freely wherever you and whenever you want to. Or, hey, you can only eat in the presence of God, but if after you guys expand and your border is extended and traveling there to where God lives is just too far for you to do as often as you would want to eat meat, well, then go ahead and eat meat. You know, you can kill in your village the way I've stipulated. So anyway, I'll stop there because I know I'm getting late.
Okay, a couple of brief comments. Basically, I think when he says whether you're ritually pure or impure, it's for the purpose of separating it from ritual, because the expectation would be, oh, this has to do with ritual. So they would be expecting to only be able to do it when they're pure.
Oh, that totally makes sense.
The fact of saying you can do it when you're pure or impure is specifically disconnecting it from ritual.
Okay, and interesting how it came across to me as the opposite, but that just doesn't make sense. So what you're saying absolutely does make sense. Okay.
Now, here's the other aspect, actually. What you're pointing out here, starting in verse 15, going to verse 19, is regarding certain types of animals, that is, gazelle or ibex. Afterward, in verse 20, that's dealing with other types of animals. Those are the types of animals from your herd and from your flock, which would be sacrificial animals. So at first, really, when it's saying you may eat meat anywhere, it's not saying that you can eat any meat anywhere. It's only saying that you can eat ibex and gazelle and those sorts of animals, which are actually wild animals, which would have to be hunted, not animals which you are keeping. So that passage actually doesn't give permission to eat any animals. So it may actually be restricting greatly the amount of animals that you can eat. And then after it's saying, when it's expanded, so basically, okay, I'll put it like this. In the first scenario that's given in verses 15 to 19, the only time in which someone under those conditions would eat domesticated animals would be when they go and do it ritually in sacrifice. That would be the only time they would eat domesticated animals.
Right.
But then it's saying when the place is chosen, if you live too far.
When the place is extended.
I'm saying when the chosen place for sacrifice is chosen.
Okay.
And then, yes, it truly, also when your borders are extended. And if you live too far, then you may eat domesticated animals as well, from the flock and from the herd. But only as I've stipulated, pouring out the blood, whatever. Pouring out the blood in this instance seems to be, again, not ritualized, and it seems potentially to be to pour out the blood because you're not going to be doing any rituals with these. You can't eat it. You can't do anything with it. You just pour it out and then eat the flesh. So, again, it's still, of course, allowing for animal sacrifice, but it doesn't seem to be, it may actually be restricting the amount of meat and of what animals could be eaten, even from among clean animals. So anyway, very interesting. Two other very brief things I want to mention. One dealing with your comment regarding the fact that this is spoken in first person, I.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of Deuteronomy as a whole, it seems to be that this is part of a speech of Moses, the way it's presented in the D source. So not necessarily saying that the words that he spoke here is something that he wrote.
I see.
But that he's speaking. And in Deuteronomy 5, it says, "And Moses called all of Israel and said to them, 'Listen, Israel, to the laws and judgments that I am speaking in your ears today.'" And so far as I can tell, from that point, Deuteronomy 5, verse 1, continuing on all the way through to Deuteronomy 12 and everything that we just read and beyond, it's all words which it says that Moses is speaking to them at that time. That said, we still have the thing in Deuteronomy 31, which is saying, and Moses wrote all these words.
Right.
But, again, it's kind of like we have to be able to parse that. Like, okay, going from Deuteronomy 5 and continuing on, it seems like it's a speech that he's giving that starts in Deuteronomy 5 and just continues on. So what exactly is the claim in Deuteronomy 31? That's something worth asking. And it might be that the claim, scholars may be right in thinking that Deuteronomy 12 to 26 was a separate document that was used for source, but it could be that the claim in Deuteronomy is of a broader section than the source that was used. In other words, Deuteronomy may be claiming Moses wrote all of this starting from chapter 5, and still it being the case that where they got the content of Deuteronomy chapter 5 and forward is of several documents, one of which is from chapter 12 to 26. Anyway, that's kind of complicated. But there's that, and then the other thing that I just want to mention is that in Richard Elliott Friedman's book, Who Wrote the Bible, he suggests that perhaps the Deuteronomist is Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, and that he, under the guidance of Jeremiah, wrote the Deuteronomistic history, including the D document of the Pentateuch. If Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 21 and 22 represent the view of the historical Jeremiah, then that could not be the case. Because, again, Jeremiah 7 verses 20 and 21 advocate the idea that Yahweh did not give commands regarding animal sacrifice during the Exodus, whereas this passage clearly does propose that. So, in other words, whoever wrote Jeremiah 7 and whoever wrote this in Deuteronomy were either not the same person, or it was a person who radically changed their view. So that's something else to keep in mind. So we do need to wrap up the call now. However, if there's something that anyone is just dying to say, of course, feel free to say it. If not, we have tomorrow night still, and we have Facebook where we can discuss this further. So if anyone would like to say any last words, we ask that you keep it brief, and feel free to do so. If not, if someone would like to thank our Heavenly Family, then now's a good time to do that as well.
I'll pray. Heavenly Family, I thank you again for this very interesting study and for guiding us step by step and even showing us the concessions that you've made with us, and so that we can appreciate what you were doing with them. And I pray that you would continue to be gracious, and I thank you for that. In the name of the branching sheet, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night. Love you all.
All right. Love you too.
Good night.